There have been a lot of people trying to make tutorials for the new gyro controls, but since they're new to gyro, they often give bad advice or don't know fully what they're talking about. I've been using gyro for a year, so I'll go over all the controls in depth and talk about which settings are the best to use. Alright, starting with the gyro controls. Off just means the gyro controls don't work, on means they work. You're going to need your controller over USB. If you don't, you're going to need a software called DS4 Windows, which will create a virtual DS4 and it'll make you think that your controller is over USB. This also works if you're using a Switch controller to make it think that it's a PS4 controller. Active building mode, this just means that whatever you have it on is when the gyro works. For none, that just defeats the purpose of the gyro because no gyro is not going to work even if it's on. Scope only means that only with scoped weapons like the MK7 and the snipers, the gyro is going to work. Scope or aiming means any gun when you're ADSing, the gyro is going to work. Scope, aiming, and harvesting just means that the gyro will work anytime except hipfire, so when you're swinging the pickaxe, the gyro will work. When you're scoping in with any gun, the gyro is going to work, but whenever you're just standing still, the gyro is not going to work. And always means the gyro will always be on. Active mode building just means when you have it on none. If you're in building or editing mode, the gyro is disabled. If it's on editing, then the gyro only works when you're editing, but not when you're building. And always means that the gyro will work when you're building or editing. Look stick effect, none means that the look stick effect won't exist. Disables means that touching the right stick will disable your gyro, and enables means touching the right stick will enable the gyro. Sensitivity means that whatever you have this number at is how many times you're going to spin. So 1.0 means that every time you spin the controller one time, you're going to spin one time in game. So a 180 is a 180 in real life. On 2.0, that means a 90-degree turn is going to be a 180 in the game. Vertical to horizontal means that whatever you have this at is going to be your x to y ratio. 1 to 1 means that your y is going to be the same as your x. 0.5 to 1 means that your y sensitivity is going to be half of your x sensitivity. Steadying means that the higher this number is at, the less shaky your camera is going to be whenever you're just holding it still or making small movements. So if you're trying to make tiny movements and your sensitivity is too high, it'll slow down. But as soon as you move your controller a little bit more, then it's going to raise your sensitivity back to normal. Acceleration means that this will multiply your real world sensitivity by whatever number this is. For example, 2.0 means that my sensitivity on 1.0 when I'm moving the controller fast will be set to 2.0. So if I snap the controller 90 degrees, I'll do a 180, but if I slowly turn it 90 degrees, do a 90-degree turn. Flick stick means that whichever direction you touch the stick, it's whichever way you'll turn. Like this. So I touch the stick 90 degrees, I'll turn 90 degrees. I touch it 180, I'll snap 180. And I can tilt it 45 degrees. This allows me to be consistent with the controller stick. Since it doesn't rotate forever, it just stops. Scoped multiplier on the advanced gyro options means that your scope sensitivity will be cut down by this amount or raised by a certain amount if you have it on a higher number. Aiming multiplier is the same thing except it's not with the snipers, it's with the ARs. Harvesting multiplier means whenever you're swinging your pickaxe, it'll change your sensitivity by that much. Building multiplier is the same thing but with building mode, and editing is the same thing but in editing mode. Zoom scale sensitivity means the farther you're scoped in, the lower your sensitivity is going to be. Gyrospace just tells the controller to either use its orientation or its orientation to the floor to turn the camera. For example, local means that this movement will always be left and right. So if you tilt your controller up, it's still going to be this movement like you're driving a car. Player means that as you tilt your controller up, the axis will change. So now this way is going to be left and right. When you have it tilted halfway, it's going to be a mix between the two. But on local, it's still going to be this way. Here's what local looks like. Here's what player looks like. Yaw, pitch, and roll directions just means that you can have this on inverted and it'll be backwards. So if I have it on invert, down makes me look up makes me look down, right makes me look left, left makes me look right. Smoothing threshold is the same thing as steadying. And dead zone tells your controller how fast to move before it starts registering it as movement. Filter controller vibration just means that if you turn this on, the controller will shake less when it vibrates. Gyro button X and Y just means whenever you're pressing your dedicated gyro button, it'll do this action. Disable gyro means holding down the gyro button will pause the motion controls until you let it go, which looks like this. Trackball means that whenever you hold the gyro button, it'll keep going in the direction you are holding it, for example. And invert means holding the button down will just invert your controls. So you turn this way, you want to keep looking left, you hold down the button, now you can keep looking left, let it go, keep looking left. Driving disable gyro just means that if you're in a car and you have this on, the gyro doesn't work. Alright, now here's what I would recommend. For active mode, I've seen a lot of recommendations to use scope or aiming. I don't recommend this unless you're very new to gyro, because you're gonna want to use your shotgun a lot, so you're gonna want to hit these flicks whenever you're fighting. And if you have it on scope or aiming, that means you can't have that fast gyro editing. But if you're new, I would recommend just practicing on this till you get the hang of it, and then switching to always on. Active mode building, if you're gonna only build with the stick, I would recommend have this on editing. I would not recommend having it on none, because you want that fast gyro editing since it's faster than stick. Here's joystick editing, this is gyro editing. Here's gyro. For look stick effect, I recommend having this either on disabled or none. Enables means that if you need to flick on someone randomly, you won't be able to do it because you're not touching the stick, obviously. Disables, I don't recommend this very much, just because you don't want to be holding down the stick and then need to flick and try to flick early. You'll miss your flick. So just have it on none. Unless you can't afford to have a gyro pause button, then have it on disabled. For sensitivity, I recommend 3.0 or higher if you're not going to use acceleration. I recommend 2.0 to 4.0 if you're going to be using medium acceleration. And I recommend 1.0 or less if you're going to be using high acceleration. Flick stick, I only don't recommend using flick stick if you're going to be using a low sensitivity, because when you use flick stick, you're going to have to build with the gyro, and if your sense is low, you can't do that. And you can't really build with flick stick very well, because you have to keep looking up and down with the gyro. If you are going to be using a lower sense, I recommend setting your building multiplier higher if you're going to use flick stick. That way you can build with the gyro and you'll still have that slower aim that you want with the motion controls. If they ever have an option to disable flick stick in building mode and enable it for normal mode, I would recommend turning flick stick on 100%. Alright, for the multipliers, I recommend if your sense is 3.0 or higher, or you're using acceleration, just to have these less than 0.5, you can set them to whatever you're comfortable to, but as long as they're less than 0.5. For harvesting multiplier, that's preference, it doesn't really matter. Building multiplier, I recommend having this higher if you're going to be building a lot with the gyro. If you're not, just set it from 1.0 to 1.5, because you might need to randomly place a wall behind you and need your sense higher. If you're going to be using 6.0 gyro or higher, I just recommend having it on 1.0. For editing, if you're using a lower gyro sense, turn this up to 1.5 or 2.0 at least. But if you're using a higher sense, you can have this on 1.0. Zoom scale sensitivity, I recommend having this on because they don't have very many ADS options here. Gyrospace have this on player, so that way if you need to look up and you still need to turn the camera. And it's just more consistent on player than it is on local. Yaw axis, roll and pitch, I recommend having these all on standard. Smoothing threshold, if you're new to gyro, set this to 5.0. If you're not, once you get the hang of gyro, I would recommend turning all of these off and having your dead zone on around 0.8 to 1.0, so that way your tiny movements aren't shaky, but they're more consistent. Filter controller vibration, if you like vibration, have that on. If you don't, just go over here and turn off vibration. For the gyro button, I recommend not using the trackball. Either have disable gyro so you can reset your hands while holding down the button, or have invert so you have that infinite range. But as a warning, invert is really hard to learn. Driving disables gyro, that's just preference. Alright, here's what stick aim versus gyro aim looks like. Here's stick. Here's gyro. Here's stick. And here's all of my settings in case you didn't see. Gyro aiming on, active mode always on both, look stick effect none, sensitivity 4.0, 1:1 ratio, acceleration off, flick stick off, advanced options on, 0.46 scoped, 0.30 aiming multiplier, harvesting multiplier 1.0, building multiplier 1.5, editing multiplier 1.0, zoom scale sensitivity on, Gyrospace player, all of these standard, none of this except dead zone 0.8, filter controller vibration on, button disables gyro, none of this matters, driving disables gyro off.